Welcome to the Spirit Room. This podcast is a gathering place for people in search of personal growth and life's higher meaning. I'm your host, Mike Consul. I also invite you to spend time on the Spirit Room website, where you'll find headlines about religion, spirituality, psychology, and the New Age movement. Just go to thespiritroom.org. There's been a lot of talk and debate lately about the guaranteed minimum income. Basically a check that would be provided to citizens by the government, probably a monthly check that would cover just the basics of life, such as basic housing, food, and clothing. Anything beyond that, you work and earn. Now, it's controversial. The whole idea is controversial, although it is being tested in at least a few countries around the world right now. The idea, though, here in the United States is that we're already handing out this money in various forms through a dozen or dozens of federal agencies. So what if all of those agencies were simply wiped out? They could be shut down, and instead people were given a payment each month, and that was it. There was no welfare, there was no other agency or form of payment that would be turned over to people. You take your basic minimum income, and that's what the government has to give you, and that is all it has to give you. There are people who argue that we could shrink government and actually balance the budget if we handle this properly, perhaps through the use of a flat tax. One of the people who has done a great deal of research and writing on the topic is Charles Clark. He's a Catholic economist at St. John's University. I interviewed him on the subject recently, and here's what he had to say.
Charles, thanks for taking the time.
I'm glad to chat with you.
Let me tell you how you came to my attention. I learned about you watching the political talking heads. The subject was income inequality, and there was a guest on there. I don't even remember his name, but I quickly jotted your name down. And he was saying there's a Catholic economist at St. John's University who makes a compelling argument that a flat tax of 39%, and we could give a living wage, basic living wage. It covers food and housing, clothing, and I guess medical care for every American. And so my question to you is this. Number one, what is a Catholic economist? Other than being Catholic, is there something deeper than that? Is it that there's a certain perspective you bring to it that relates to the faith? What exactly is a Catholic economist, and do you even label yourself that way?
I do, and I wouldn't define it as an economist who happens to be Catholic. But I would define it as someone who takes the perspective, particularly the perspective of Catholic social thought, as sort of the value foundation that you use to look at the economy. So it doesn't change. You don't have a separate or an independent economic theory. There isn't a Catholic economic theory or a Catholic economic policy. But the vision that you would look, the questions you would ask, the tools, the way you would evaluate outcomes would be inspired by the Gospels and developed through the Catholic tradition and what is called Catholic social thought. So the importance of human dignity, the common good, solidarity, protecting the environment. You know, there's a 200-year, maybe 150-year tradition of popes and others writing what is called the Catholic social thought, the modern Catholic social thought tradition, reflecting on economic issues from the perspective of the values of the gospel. Pope Francis's latest encyclical that deals with the environment is an addition to that tradition.
Now, you've written about, and you've even worked on, a national policy that gives citizens a guaranteed minimum income. Tell us about the mechanics of a policy of that sort. How would that work here in the United States?
Well, I've worked on a couple sort of as an outside expert proposals. One, the most work I've done is on a proposal in Ireland, and actually worked with groups in Ireland and then the Irish government on the Green Paper on the possibilities of such a policy. And then I've done work for groups in Canada, and then I've done less in the United States than other groups. And the mechanics that I was brought into is how you would transition from what would be a complex social welfare system, which each country has one that's different, to one that is basic income system, which was basically the replacing of most of the welfare state with a guaranteed income for all citizens based on, citizenship. It would be lower for children, and it might be different, higher or lower for senior citizens. Basically, replacing Social Security. Most European countries already have it, a child income, but it would be providing that. And then you have to figure out how to pay for it. Now, the easiest way when you're proposing it, because you propose it for the benefits of having this guaranteed income, and then the simplest way to pay for it is with a flat tax. And that's because you don't have to deal with all the complexities of a tax system, because you're not trying to arrange, this deduction with that benefit. You just go straight to a flat tax, which, when I last did this for the United States, you could provide everyone an income at what is the official poverty level for a flat tax. I think it was 36% the last time that I costed it out. And that's with a balanced budget, no deficit. Now, I am not arguing that we should have a balanced budget and no deficit. That's a totally different issue. And I'm not arguing for a flat tax. It's just that if you're designing a system like this, it's much easier to do it and to look at the pluses and minuses in terms of a flat tax, because when you have a complex tax system like we do, then you're debating every single deduction and every tax rate, and you're debating things that have nothing to do with the argument for a guaranteed minimum income for each citizen.
It sounds like you could make the argument that you could actually shrink government doing this, because, as you were just saying, rather than going for food stamps and SSI and all kinds of different social programs that are now in place and have to be run by some bureaucracy, you're basically eliminating all of that and saying you're going to get a minimum, you're going to get a check. You're going to get a check.
Yeah.
We can get rid of a lot of these agencies and could actually slim the government down. Is my thinking on course with yours as far as that goes?
Well, the strange thing about a basic income is that you have conservatives like Milton Friedman who argued in favor of one for reasons similar to what you just stated, and then you had liberals like John Kenneth Galbraith who argued for one for other reasons. But one of the benefits, and particularly the work I did in Ireland went into this in considerable detail, is that you get the government out of the business of regulating the poor, and here you're providing them with a minimum income in which their own agency has to answer the question of how are they going to use this, instead of, well, you can spend this only on that, and you have to show up every week at this time, and I'm regulating what you're doing. If you're unemployed in many countries, you're not allowed to work at all on the side, which is not a good thing to encourage people not to work. So instead of regulating all these aspects of people's lives, you're saying, okay, well, we're going to give you this support, and thus you will need a lot less. So in the Irish example, I think we were reducing the department that dealt with all these programs in terms of the labor force, almost in half. You still need social workers to help people who have real problems, to help mothers who don't know how to raise their children, or people who are addicted to drugs still need to be helped off drugs. But much of our system is in regulating the poor and not in assisting them. So you couldn't completely eliminate everything, but you wouldn't need anywhere near the size that we have now.
Let's talk about the flat tax for a moment. You said I'm not advocating a flat tax, but it could work. You've costed it out that way. When you talk about a flat tax without no deductions, simplify it. Are we talking today? A lot of people in Washington talking about broadening the base, broadening the tax base. Would everybody pay that flat tax, or are you cutting? Is there a dividing line between those who actually pay taxes and those who don't?
The dividing line is if you have earned income, and when I've estimated out, I treated all earned income the same, whether it was capital gains, dividends, just all earned income would be taxed at the same rate. So that in the Irish example, when I was answering questions, so Bono would be paying the same price as the people who go to see him, he being much richer than the average citizen in Ireland or anywhere else on the planet. But yeah, so there would, in every, not only that I did, but everyone I've seen, there would be no deductions for anything.
Okay, so if I am receiving a check from the government, I'm getting the basic income, and then I make $5,000 extra just doing odd jobs, that's taxed at a 36 or 39 or 40%, or whatever the rate is. I would pay on any income.
Yeah, so everyone pays the same marginal tax rate, but the effective tax rate would be different, because if you add in the basic income, then take out the taxes you've paid, the rate will be much lower for people with low incomes and higher for people with high incomes. So there's a progressivity in terms of the net benefit. But in terms of you earn money, 36% goes to finance the whole federal government, including this system.
And the check the government gives you, that's your basic check as an American citizen that you're entitled to, let's just call it an entitlement at this point anyway, you don't pay taxes on that. That taxes have been paid so that you receive that money. Is that correct?
Yeah, that would be tax-free.
Okay, so you worked for the Canadian government, you worked for the Irish government. Has this actually been put into practice anywhere in the form that you're talking about?
I worked for a group in Canada, not with the Canadian government, but interestingly enough, the Trudeau administration in Canada, the new Prime Minister who was just recently in America, is an advocate for basic income and will be running, I believe, an experiment. That is, some area in Canada is going to get a basic income, and they're going to see what kind of effects it has had. Well, there are versions of basic incomes or guaranteed incomes. Of course, the state of Alaska has one, which is called the Permanent Fund. So they take half of the oil revenues that they get in a given year and divide it up based on how many citizens are living in Alaska for 11 months of that year.
But that's a piddling check.
Yeah, I think when oil prices were high, it might have been $2,000 per person. And what a lot of Alaskans did is that went into the college fund for the kids. But it is, by a long shot, the most popular government program in the United States. It has like a 96% approval rating.
Oh, no, that's interesting. Yeah.
So everyone likes it. And there have been people who suggested on a national level that if you took income from natural resources and did the same thing, instead of using a flat tax, you would be, using all of the income generated by oil, gas, coal, grazing fees, or whatever fees and incomes the natural resources of the country make. Now, of course, a lot of those natural resources are privately held, so you would have to nationalize them first if you wanted to pay for it that way. But some people have suggested doing that. In other countries, and Mexico and Brazil and a lot of developing countries are doing an income grant. It's not completely free of conditions. It's a family grant, and the conditions are your children have to not miss school, so they're not allowed to have a certain number of absences. And I think in Mexico you have to bring the kid to a doctor twice a year. So it's things you want to encourage, but it's really not burdensome for the family to make sure their kids are going to school and make sure that they're getting checkups. And there's been very effective in Brazil, where it was introduced, and in Mexico, in reducing income inequality, and it's had a tremendous effect in small business development in those states that have introduced it. Because a lot of people now say, oh, now I have a cushion and some money that instead of looking for very low-paying jobs, I can maybe move up the value chain and maybe start my own business making rugs or shirts or whatever it is, instead of being at the bottom end, move up a bit. And I've had a lot of work has been done to show that it's had this sort of economic stimulus effect, which was not its intention. The intention was to deal with the very high levels of poverty in those areas.
Well, and that's one of the other things I want to ask you about is if I'm a business executive or an investor, does this model make me a wealthier person? Does it or maybe more to the point, not necessarily a wealthier person, but does this diminish my ability to succeed financially? Does it improve it? I mean, even if it's a wash, suddenly poor people are being taken care of probably in a better way. So I suppose you could certainly call that a gain. But if you're standing in front of Congress and being accused of being a socialist, which I'm sure you have been accused of many, many times, Charles, what's your comeback if they say, what's this going to do to our economy?
Well, it certainly changes things. For one thing, I think it addresses one of the problems that not only the United States but all the developed economies have, is that it's starting to deal with this reality of a very atypical labor market where people, it's rarer now that people get a job, work for one employer their whole life, and then retire with a pension. Instead, they're having multiple jobs, and a lot of these, particularly for younger people, are short-term contracts or that they're going back to school, they're changing occupations, and here you're providing security to deal with the fact that reality is here, and it's in Europe, it's all over the place, and so you sort of have this floor, and you're giving people a lot more freedom. Now, in giving people a lot more freedom, it also means the freedom sometimes to say no. This proposal of basic income was proposed and almost passed in the United States in the early 70s. Nixon was actually leaning in favor of it, and it looked like it was going to pass. And then the Southern Democrats moved against it. And the reason they moved against it is that they realized that now in the South you would have a lot of black agricultural workers who were no longer easy to control, because the social welfare systems in the southern states was often set up that all benefits would cease at planting and harvest season, so that everyone had to go out and work in the fields. And if you gave people a guaranteed income, you'd have a harder time finding people to, pick cotton and do jobs that people don't want to do, that we now have a lot of immigrants doing. So it certainly would change some of the power relations within society. I think, and this is a debate, whether this would cause wages to go up a bit or not. Many people think it's a subsidy for wages, so it would keep wages low, but other people argue that since workers have the ability in extreme circumstances to say no, that the general wage floor will start to go up, similar to like a minimum wage increase. I'm not sure which would happen. I would think some places it could go one way and some the other. Every country is different. I don't think there's a general rule that you could follow with this. But I mean, the basic income system is designed to change the distribution of income and push money down, and so.
Which then gets spent on people who are, have businesses and whatnot, and the money goes back up as well. I mean, it's a symbiotic system. But let me ask you this: when I've brought this up to some people, Charles, they've said, so what's everybody going to do? Sit around smoking pot and watching TV, and they're not going to work anymore? I mean, I don't think Americans are necessarily. I always think of Americans as being very industrious, but what about the argument that if you give people enough money to just sit around and do nothing, then where does innovation come from? Where does the momentum of the drive forward of civilization and the economy come from?
Well, I think we could start off by agreeing that Americans work too much. I mean, we work close to 2,000 hours on average a year, and the Europeans are around 1,400 hours. So if Americans worked a little less, that wouldn't necessarily be bad. And particularly, one of the things they found with the Affordable Care Act is that you did have a decrease in workers, but these are people who are working only because they needed to work in order to get health insurance. That if they could get health insurance without working, they would choose that. So if people are choosing not to work, that's not necessarily bad. They're getting what they want. Now, the level of payment is so low that you can have a basic, a simple life, but it's hard to find many Americans who want to have a simple life. Mm-hmm. And so the drive to do better, you're always better off working than not working, is still there. And, one of the reasons that the Irish government was looking at this and was being pushed is that due to the complexity of their system, at certain incomes, if your income went up, your net income went down because you lost more benefits than you gained in income, and we had these, what they were calling them, poverty traps, and particularly in the UK, I found when I worked on a proposal for the UK, that when your income went from £12,000 to £15,000, your net income was declining. Here in this system, you're always better off by working and not working. The poverty trap or negative effect is only the tax rate of 35%. You're not facing marginal tax rates of 110%, 115%. If you get a household that is on food stamps and getting some public assistance, and their income goes up to the point where they lose that assistance, often their net income is lower when their income went up than it was before the income and the public assistance. So you always want to have it structured so that people are always better off working than not working, because you want to encourage that. You certainly don't want to discourage work. But if people decide to work less, we should respect that they want to work less.
Well, we used to work a lot more. I mean, we used to do nothing but work, and everybody seems to think it's progress to have knocked the work day down to 8 hours.
It depends how far back you go, because when we lived in caves, we probably only worked 10, 15 hours a week. And, in the Middle Ages, there were 187 religious days off. Well, that's over half a year. So I think we're actually working a lot more than a lot of our ancestors did.
The other thing we're seeing going on here, and a lot's been written about it, I've written about this myself, is that with the computerization, automation, robotics, it's becoming more and more evident that there's an awful lot of jobs that are simply going to go away, and we've got a lot of big companies that are just piling up. I mean, just huge retained mountains of retained earnings. I think I forget the figure, but I think it may be around $7 trillion in retained earnings globally among corporations, not because they just want to sit on the money. They're actually not finding places to put the money in some cases.
Yeah.
And so they're sitting on this, and as we become more productive because things become more automated, and eventually robots are even able to do a lot of the work that we don't even want to do, like cleaning a home and whatnot. Aren't we going to reach a stage where we're not going to have a choice but to say this is the wealth of nations, and we distribute it, maybe not equally, but we distribute it so that people have got a means to have a decent life?
Yeah, I mean, from 1817 to today, economists have been thinking about the problem of technological unemployment. It was David Ricardo, I think it was 1818, the second edition of his book. He edited a chapter on machinery where he pointed out, which was the big issue in England at the time, that maybe these are going to replace some jobs that we have to start thinking about this. Now, the economy has always grown in a way that when the horse was replaced by the car, you had a net addition in jobs. But the last 20 years, or last 40 years, I think has shown that that trend has certainly changed, and seems to be increasing. That so many, I mean, you look at the steel industry, that we're producing the same amount of steel each year with less and less workers. We used to have 100,000 steel workers, and 10,000 now produce the same amount, and it's just that those trends are continuing. And you look at, this is all going to the argument is that these will all be replaced by service sector jobs. But you know, there's only so much growth that you can have in there. It would seem to me that we are going to run into the problem that our ability to produce goods so outstrips the income that will be there to buy those goods, because fewer and fewer workers and owners will be attached to the incomes that production creates. And so I think this is why a lot of economists are looking at this proposal, because clearly we need to do something different to deal with that. Now, you have a lot of philosophers who have been writing about this for other reasons, in terms of giving people freedom and other things, which are important, but a lot of economists are looking at it because it just looks like we are not going to have substantial growth in new sectors in the economy to replace the ones where technology has made workers redundant.
Now, you've been quoted as saying a quote-unquote sick and stupid population is not a good economic policy. What did you mean by that?
Okay. It's something I've said more than once. It's usually part of a presentation I give which looks at development policy. And if you look at the 70s and 80s, the World Bank and the IMF would force developing countries to cut their spending on education and health care so that they can meet their external debt. This is part of the Latin American and Third World debt crisis. And this was a disaster. I mean, growth rates declined in all these countries. And again, I think for the obvious reason that sick and stupid is not a good development strategy. That is, if your basic wealth of nations, as Adam Smith pointed out, is based on the productivity of your workers. And if they're hungry, and if they're not skilled and not educated, and if they're sick and not healthy, then they're not going to be productive. But if we invest in human capital, then we'll have much better development and growth prospects. And until the financial crisis, there was very clear evidence, particularly in Africa, that it was working, that you had a lot of countries that were developing because they were developing their own businesses and their own workers, and not based on aid or anything like that, but based on the work, improving their education systems. They were getting healthier, reducing malaria, dealing with HIV, all these things, making workers healthier, and it was having positive economic benefits.
Income inequality obviously is a huge issue these days. I mean, the Republicans are even talking about it. They used to call it class warfare. Now they're actually addressing income inequality. How did we get here, in your estimation, Charles? Why did income get so out of whack? Why are the people at the top making so much more than the people in the middle or the bottom?
Well, I think there's like three things that are happening that are a little separate. So there isn't like one magic bullet. The first thing is that clearly you've had a change in the labor markets, and so that the pay for the higher skilled has gone up, and the competition for low skilled and medium skilled has gone up to keep those down. So in the 50s and 60s, the average American worker was only competing against the average American worker, then eventually the average European worker, but now he's competing against Vietnamese and Chinese and Mexican, Brazilian workers. And so the bottom 60% of the labor market, those incomes have stagnant or declined. So that's, I think, part of the story. And we have reduced the sort of the protection. They don't have unions protecting them. The government doesn't protect them as much as they used to. And so they're not in a good bargaining position, so their incomes have declined. Whereas the top maybe 10% of workers who have gotten advanced degrees and can do the computer skills and do all this stuff, they have grown very rapidly. That's part of it. Another part is that the tax policy has changed, and we've reduced dramatically taxes on the top. The top marginal rate before Reagan was at 90%. He lowered it down to 70, and then finally went down to 26. So we decreased how much we support the bottom, and we've definitely reduced how much we tax the top. But a good part of what's happened, and really the top 1%, where their gain has come from, is just the rise of finance. Because in the 50s and 60s, the financial sector accounted for maybe 8% of the economy, 12% of corporate profits, and that's gone to 12% of the economy, I think it is, but the profits 20 to 40%, in the range of total corporate profits have gone to what would be finance, insurance, and real estate, and that the sort of the capture of so much of the economy by Wall Street and then taking a share at this. And we saw this with the housing bubble. The housing bubble was the financialization of the mortgage market. For a long time, you got a mortgage from your bank. The bank got deposits from its depositors. And in the 70s, Wall Street wasn't involved at all. We were financing 2 million new homes a year, and everything was working fine and dandy. Inflation started to screw things up, but basically it was a model that worked. Wall Street got involved with securitization and all that. It didn't allow us to build more houses because we're still at a peak. We're about 2 million new homes built a year. But now, a large chunk of that money is going through through Wall Street, and when you add the fraud that was involved, then they got huge profits. Similarly with healthcare. Many countries have healthcare without any insurance involved at all. It's completely separate from the financial system. Well, ours, all of it goes through the financial system at some point. They're going to take a cut. So that much of the big increase in income inequality is really a shift to that industry and to those locations where people live. I think it's Jamie Galbraith did a study where he showed that if you take out like a handful of zip codes or counties, not zip codes, counties, if you take out the ones around New York City, Washington, D.C., and Silicon Valley, the income inequality increase is very slight.
Interesting.
But if you add them, it's tremendous. And that's because the income is all shifted from the whole economy to those zip codes, and that's where people live who work in Wall Street, who work in lobbying in Washington, or work in Silicon Valley, which is the third thing. And that is, whenever you have a tremendous change in technology, like the rise of the automobile or oil and trains back in the day, and now it's the internet, that you're going to have a tremendous amount of wealth created that's only going to go to a few people, and then over a couple generations, either through government policy or through giving it away or whatever, it starts to filter down. So some part of this is just, we had the same thing at the first 20 years of the 20th century, and that part of it is just birth of new sectors, people capturing the wealth effects of that before it becomes institutionalized instead of in people, in companies. Shareholder ownership gets more widely dispersed. The Rockefellers create charities to give away the money, and then you go through a process where it starts filtering out a bit. So you have a little bit of that effect. But I would say most of it is the financialization of the economy.
So is a basic living wage workable in the United States right now? Do you think politically it's or do you think we're moving in a direction politically where it's going to be something that they would contemplate seriously, as they did? You referenced Richard Nixon back when he was in office. We were talking about this, which was before I was really paying attention to what was going on politically. That's kind of an eye opener. Is this workable at all right now?
Well, I mean, I think it's very important. A basic income is a basic income. It's not a wage that you're getting paid. So we certainly see some discussion of a basic income in the United States. A lot more attention is going on to raising the minimum wage to what people call a living wage, to whatever it would be, to make sure that if you worked 40 hours a week full-time, that you would be above the poverty line for a family of whatever size. So I think there's a lot more push or a lot more support for that. So I think politically in the United States, I think that will get a lot more traction. I mean, there is a growing interest in basic income, but I think Canada and some of the European countries will go there before we do.
So what is a basic living wage then? Right now in the United States, if you were to come up with a figure, what would each American be receiving? And what is that expected to cover?
Well, I mean,
I know it's not a softball question.
Well, it's actually a difficult question because at one level, people look at, well, what would get people above the poverty level? However, most people who study poverty realize that the official poverty rate in the United States is grossly underestimated. For one thing, it doesn't account for the cost of living differences between, so if I'm earning $23,000 in New York City, that's very different from $23,000 in rural Mississippi. And so when we think of these national, these cutoffs, most of the work that's done on living wages is done really at the county or city level. That it's how much does it cost for an apartment in Queens? That's minimum for that, and how much to buy food in Queens. And so in New York, it would be fairly high. It would probably be close to $30,000 a year to be considered making the minimum of a decent living, whereas in other places in the United States, it would be very different. And I expect, in Silicon Valley, I think if you're earning $100,000, you feel like you're poor and struggling paycheck to paycheck, then you're probably living 2.5 hours away from where you work because you can't afford anything, and that's a good income. It's called the living wage movement, and it's very much tied towards locality to figure out how much are rents there, how much are food prices there, et cetera.
Wouldn't you have to make it the same though for everybody, Charles? Because somebody could, you have an address, let's say in New York City, and you're paid at that rate, but you're actually funneling the money to Poughkeepsie, New York, and living far better. Wouldn't you have to make it a flat stipend for everybody?
Yes, no, it would be hard to enforce. I mean, I know someone who is working on a proposal to adjust Social Security payments based on where you live. But, in today's reality where banking is, the Internet, it's not an office that I go and cash my check and get money out of. You'd probably have to have it at one level. So in all the work that I've done, I've just, rather than get into the fight over what is the proper poverty level and all that, which I've written on, but you want to look at one issue at a time, I've always put a basic income at whatever the official poverty rate is. So that would be around probably $10,000 a person.
Interesting. So I can see that if a person could work less because they've got kind of the basics covered, it would improve their health in some cases. I would think there's an awful lot of stress-related and fatigue-related medical problems in this country, and there's an awful lot of people who don't spend as much time as they would like with their children or reading some fine literature or taking walks or what have you. It sounds like a really appealing sort of program for many people.
Most of the evidence in terms of the labor market impacts show that the only group where you'd find a significant reduction in how many hours people would work would be women with children. And that's pretty easy to figure out why. But the others, the evidence shows that when they've run experiments in different places, that men and single women basically work about the same amount of hours because, most people would rather have more than less.
Yeah. So it doesn't really sideline the workforce, but it takes some of the pressure off, it streamlines the government, at least theoretically. So you're saying that, for instance, in Canada, they're looking at experimenting with this. You say that you admit that you don't know necessarily how it would affect the economy, but it sounds like we're going to have some experiments run here, and you're going to be able to do a fresh round of writing and thinking, or thinking and writing, I should say that in the proper order, on the subject.
Well, one thing that economists should do is try to realize where the knowledge gets fuzzy or ends. You should be humble. When we look at small changes, proposals, well, then we could say that with some confidence that these effects are likely to happen. But when you have something which is not dramatic in terms of the number of dollars, but certainly dramatic in terms of the structure and power relations, it will be different, and there's no way that you could predict that accurately. Which is why it's good to go in small steps to see how people will react and what effects it might have.
And to the people out there, of which there are many who say, why should I pay for somebody else? Why should the government take money away from me and give it to somebody else? That's not right. I suspect, based on what you've said, Charles, your comeback might be you're already paying the money. You're already doing that. And what we're talking about is streamlining government. And you said that we do have the resources to do this. Your calculation is a balanced budget, a 36% tax rate the last time you ran the numbers. It may have changed. And so people are already paying the money. And, of course, we never account for the wealth redistribution that goes upward, which has been quite tremendous, and I guess since the Reagan administration in particular. Anyway, I'm kind of meandering at this point. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, certainly if, like certain people who have run for president recently, you were only paying 14% tax rate, that wouldn't happen anymore. Everyone would be paying the same rate. So certainly certain groups would certainly be affected. In terms of, we all are dependent on others at some point. And we need to move away from this idea that I support myself and nobody's helping me. Well, everyone gets help at some point, and everyone helps others at some point. And this is just sort of putting everyone into a more equal status. So it won't be based on whether you had rich parents, whether you had a comfortable upbringing as a child. It won't. When you get old, it won't be based on whether your pension fund didn't get rated or you even had a pension. It will be based you'll be equaling out parts of it. I calculated it's taking about 20% of the distribution of income and saying, okay, we're going to divide all this equally. It still leaves 80% for us to haggle over, fight over. I'm going to try to get as much as I can so I can impress people, or I'm not that interested, and I'll work on my skills as a skier or as a surfer or something like that. But so you still have 80% of the incentives in the market working, driving people. You're just taking part of it and saying, okay, well, we're just going to do this equally without having an inefficient way of taking part of it and dividing it up with all sorts of complex rules, with a huge bureaucracy managing and monitoring everyone. And it's just say, no, we're just going to do this nice and simple, and then still allowing markets to work. 80% controlling income seems to be enough of an incentive.
Spoken like a true Catholic, we are our brothers and sisters' keeper, and we will render unto Caesar what is his or its due. Charles, this has been a really interesting discussion. My guest, if you've jumped in the middle of this recording, is Charles Clark. He's a Catholic economist at St. John's University, and we've been talking about the basic living wage, the policy proposal that many countries are having a dalliance with, and they're certainly talking about it here in the United States. Charles is the author of papers and books on the subject. Obviously, you've studied this in great detail. Charles, thank you for spending the time with us.
I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.